Good morning. It's good to be with you again. I'm Susan Bailey, and I am the teaching director for the Sussex Group, and I'm happy to be with you all today. The opening to this week's workbook lesson says about the Israelites. At last, they were free, but they were more than just physically free of Egypt. They were also free to choose what they would do next. Follow God faithfully to the new life that He had prepared for them, or pine for their old way of life in Egypt. Much of our lesson today will center on grumbling, but before we get there, I want to address the Israelites' tendency to continually pine for their old way of life when they encounter difficult circumstances in their new one. I can kind of understand the Israelites' tendency to do this. For one, there's comfort in the known versus the unknown. For one, when the old or known is not always good, it's still at least known. But an even bigger reason is that the Israelites' eyes were simply on what they wanted in the moment. They were not interested in the long term or what God wanted. And until they could consistently fix their eyes on the Lord and trust Him and His will and be obedient, they were destined to continue to bounce back and forth between following God and sinning and then grumbling about the consequences of sin. I know what it's like to bounce back and forth because I was not choosing to consistently look to the Lord and what He called me to do. I came to know Jesus at the age of 15 and spent the next 30 plus years at a wonderful church, learning about Jesus, serving, and building lifelong friendships. Our life was pretty much centered around the church. In fact, we even built a community with some other friends behind it. And then life changed. Our pastor retired, and the denomination brought in a new one. I'm sure many of you have been involved in pastoral changes and know that unfortunately, sometimes they're not always pretty. And this one was unfortunately downright ugly. Basically, our church split, with some folks going off to start a new church and others resolutely staying behind to support the new pastor. Where did I stand? For me, this was a family breakup. So like we see in split families sometimes, I kind of bounced back and forth between the old church and the new church, kind of like a pinball in a pinball machine, and some days that's exactly how I felt. Why? Because my eyes were on me and what I wanted. Basically, I was kind of a hot mess because I just wanted to be in whatever church was going to be most like the old one. It was not until I consistently put my eyes on Jesus again and not a church or what I pined for that I was finally able to move on and find the church home that God wanted me in. So back to our friends, the Israelites. As we know, they've been on a roller coaster ride in life. They'd served long and hard as Egyptian slaves. They waited it out while their God sent plague after plague upon their Egyptian slave masters. But finally, life was starting to look up for our friends. It looked like they might actually be free. But then wait a minute. Before they knew it, the Egyptians, as we talked about last week, were on the move to take the Israelites back to slavery. But God, as we all know, God of course steps in to part the Red Sea to ultimately save His people, the Israelites, and then brings down the water to drown Pharaoh and his great Egyptian army as they try to follow and capture God's chosen people. Now, what do you think your mindset would have been after this wild ride? I'd like to think my mindset would be one of praise and faith as well as readiness to follow God and His leader Moses. But if I'm honest, I think I'd probably be worrying about when the next shoe was going to drop. Think about it. Every time things looked up or good for the Israelites, something bad seemed to happen. And you know, if that's your mindset in life, and it has been mine at times, then you're probably not just waiting for the other shoe to drop, you are actively looking ahead for it to do so. That kind of thinking predisposes us to grumbling because our eyes are on ourselves and what we want, not on our great God and what He desires and can do. We'll come back to that in a minute, but let's talk first about what happens in our story today. We know that after celebrating their deliverance from the Egyptians with song and dance, the Israelites set out for the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days into the wilderness without finding any water. And of course, you know what happened then. The grumbling began immediately. I'm sure there were even folks who said, I told you that we shouldn't go into the wilderness. I told you something bad was going to happen. Or others who said, we can't trust God, and we certainly can't trust those crazy brothers who always seem to be leading us into trouble. So we know what happens next. Moses then cries out to the Lord, who shows him a log, which he throws into the water, and that turns the water sweet. Problem solved. Here's your water. It is also in the wilderness of Shur that the Lord specifically lays out what he requires of the Israelites. He tells them that if they will diligently listen to his voice of the Lord and do what is right in his eyes and give ear to his commandments and keep his statutes, he will put none of the diseases on them that he had put on the Egyptians, for he would be the Israelites' Lord and their healer. So let's just sum up then all the things that the Lord did do for the Israelites at Marah before we move on. He made the water sweet and drinkable. He gave them that statute or rule to guide them with the promise that he wouldn't put any of the diseases on them that the Egyptians had had. And he brought them to Elim, a place where there was 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there. Sounds like a pretty good place to land. But wait, before we know it, our Israelites are grumbling again. Why this time? Well, they're hungry. And I think these verses are some of the most striking in the whole story. And I've mentioned them before, but they're worth mentioning again. Because it says, the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Egyptians in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. And here we go again with the grumbling. Grumbling can actually be defined as complaining in a bad-tempered way. Grumbling stems from false expectations on our part as to what God will do, which is certainly something that we see with the Israelites. One of the results of grumbling is that it obviously hinders our relationship with the Lord and our ability to enjoy his blessings, which brings us to today's central idea. Grumbling reveals a lack of trust in God. Maureen Hall Pusini lays out 7 reasons why believers should not grumble. First, it angers God. As we see in the Word, almost all of the judgments which strike down the Israelites come because of their never-ending complaining. Second, it blinds us to our blessings. As we see in the story, the Lord has provided water to the Israelites and a great place for them to camp. But they've forgotten all of those already because they only have eyes for their bellies because they're hungry. Third, grumbling prevents us from being effective salt and light in this world. If we sound just like society, which tends to complain over the least little thing, how can we be a witness to the rest of the world? Next, focusing on the negative actually does nothing but depress us. Grumblers aren't happy people. Their inner world is darkened, and I love how she puts this because she says their inner world is darkened because instead of enjoying the sunshine, they keep pulling the shades down. Fifth, grumbling disables our spiritual weapons like praise and worship. Lastly, grumbling can poison our faith. If we tend to focus on our way and then grumble because we did not get our way, how are we looking to God and living out our faith? So we know as believers, it's obvious that grumbling is not something that we should be doing. But let's face it, life isn't always easy. I'm not talking about simple irritants like bad weather. I'm talking about those really difficult things like an illness or a problem in our family. Honestly, I don't believe it's healthy to keep those things bottled up. So can we really not grumble about them, even a little? Is there any way to express our complaints in a biblical way? John Bloom on desiringgod.org says that when we complain, it is frequently evil, but there is a solution. He proposes that there can be faithful or believing way to complain and not just faithless, unbelieving way. Bloom contends that grumbling complaints directly or indirectly declare that God is not sufficiently good, faithful, loving, wise, dependable, powerful, or competent. Otherwise, he would treat us better or run the universe more effectively. Faithless complaining is sinful because it accuses God of doing wrong. As I read this and I think of my complaining over the course of my life, I ask, is it really not okay to grumble sometimes? According to Bloom, there can be faithful complaining. That is, complaining that does not impugn God with wrong. Rather, it is an honest, groaning expression of what it's like to experience the trouble, anguish, and grief of living in a fallen, futile world. So then, how are we supposed to grumble in a biblical way? Bloom in his article explains that the book of Psalms contains the prayers and hymns that God chose to teach us about how to express ourselves in worship to him. About 1/3 of those psalms are laments, where the writers poured out to God their sorrow, anger, fear, longing, confusion, desolation, repentance, disappointment, and depression, either because of external evil or internal evil and darkness. These laments actually are treasures for us because they model for us how to complain to God in a way that honors him. Is it not awesome that our God doesn't just tell us to stuff our legitimate laments? As Bloom says, God knows that we frequently will experience bewildering pain and therefore will frequently need to express our pain to him. Key words, to him. When we face difficult times, we must go to the Lord first. It doesn't mean that we can't ever go to another person, but God has to be our first destination, and his word must be our first tool in how to deal with the difficult circumstances according to his will. For example, David wrote Psalm 142 before he was king. God had already told Saul that David would be the king and would replace him someday. So Saul was after David, and as he was writing this psalm, David is hiding out from the current king in a cave. David begins his lament, his prayer, in verses 1-2. With my voice, I cry out to the Lord. With my voice, I plead mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint to him. I pour my trouble before him. David even laments in verse 4, there is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. These are some hard and honest words. But what's the key? David is not challenging or criticizing God in these verses. He is simply bringing it straight to him and giving him honor and glory at the same time, as he says in verse 5. I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. There is no grumbling here. David is just laying out his heart and his concerns before his God who loves him. I want to share a personal story about grumbling and how the Lord took me through it. Back in 2010, our oldest son lost his job, and it took him almost a year to find a new one. So he and his wife sold their home, and with our two little granddaughters, moved into ours. A little bit about a backstory about layoffs in our family. Unfortunately, our family was no stranger to them. My husband had actually been laid off basically a month before we were to get married back in the day, and then laid off again in his 40s. And both times were periods when I was not working outside of the home and he was the sole breadwinner. While we ultimately saw good and better jobs after my husband got laid off, layoffs still actually became one of my biggest fears in life. If my husband came home and said anything negative about work, my first question would always be, there's not going to be a layoff, is there? I was frequently scared by just baseless fears about layoffs. So here I am with this mindset, and the Lord and I had plenty of conversations over the years about it. So you can imagine my disappointment when my son got laid off. As parents, it's one thing when it happens to you, but quite another when it happens to your children. Honestly, I was devastated and depressed. As I said, my son's layoff lasted almost a year. And I won't lie to you, during that time I grumbled and I sinned, particularly in the beginning. But I also know that my great God had compassion on me and gave me a wonderful psalm that I read constantly and that I clung to, and that it helped me to get through this time and to be able to turn it over to God. It didn't mean that I didn't cry at times, but for the most part, God helped anchor me in this psalm and showed me that I must always go to him first and then praise him and wait for him, even though at times I may struggle and cry my eyes out. I'm going to end today by reading a part of that psalm. I have revisited it many times over the years, as you can see. I don't know if you can see that, but all the writing and different colored pens and everything in there. It is one of my favorite psalms in life. Will there be another layoff? Will some other bad thing happen? Will I grumble? I hope I will remember all that God has done in my life and my family's life. And I hope that I'll remember this lesson as well and meet its challenge to choose to replace my grumbling with gratitude. And in turn, we'll pull out Psalm 33 again and turn to my God. I'm going to read a couple verses from that psalm because they're so meaningful. Starting with verse 11. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance. From heaven the Lord looks down and sees all mankind. From his dwelling he watches all who live on the earth. He who forms the hearts of all, who considers everything they do. No king is saved by the size of his army. No warrior escapes by his great strength. A horse is a vain hope for deliverance. Despite all of its great strength, it cannot save. But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those whose hope is in his unfailing love, to deliver them from death and keep them alive in famine. We wait in hope for the Lord. He is our shield and our help. In him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in his holy name. May your unfailing love rest upon us, O Lord, even as we put our hope in you. And lastly today, I leave you with the challenge from the lesson. Will you choose to replace grumbling with gratitude? Have a great day.